The wind carried dust like whispered prayers through the auction yard, curling around boots and broken boards, threading through the slats of the old corral, where a black mare shifted restlessly. The air was dry, painted gold by a late afternoon sun that filtered through cottonwood branches overhead. Folks came here for trade, not talk, and they traded hard livestock tools, names sometimes futures. James Boone stepped through the gate, his coat hanging heavy on shoulders, too familiar with loss. He had the look of a man who'd been carved out of grief, all sharp lines and softened eyes. The townsfolk knew him, though they no longer asked how he was. A man widowed young with nothing but a dead field and a rusted plow earned his silence. Still he came for the mare. He had coin in his pocket and need in his bones. The farm wouldn't wait for sorrow. A boy announced the next round. The mare whinnied, the crowd shifted. James stood still, eyes scanning the pens with quiet purpose, not a flicker of urgency in him. The auctioneer, a thick-bellied man in a frayed bowler hat, lifted a cane and struck it once on the stand. Next, not a horse, he grinned, yellow teeth flashing. But she carries just the same. The laughter that followed felt wrong before the girl was even let out. From the side of the stable came a girl no older than 20. Barefoot with a torn hem and a dark shawl clutched over her shoulders, she stepped out as if walking through fire. Her eyes were too wide, face too pale, and her stomach too round beneath the shawl to be hidden. The murmur spread like spilled oil, men shifting, women whispering, boots scraping dry earth. "Name's Mercy," the auctioneer said, tipping his hat like it was some joke. "Her pa says he's done with her, and she's got no home but a debt to clear. He's offering her up one time only." From behind the girl, a man slouched against a post, Gideon Talbot. Red-faced and slick with sweat, he waved a hand like he was selling a mule. "Ain't nobody forced her here," he muttered. "Girl's been trouble since the cradle. Belly full of bastard and not a penny to feed it." No one spoke. The town had seen cruelty, but this was something sour. Mercy's eyes met no one's. She stared at the ground like it might open and swallow her. James didn't move. His breath was shallow. The mare forgotten. "Who's got a home needs tend," in the auctioneer called, trying to lace levity through shame. "She's strong, mostly quiet. Good cook. Can sew." No hands rose. Mercy didn't cry. That was the strangest part. She just stood there, fingers trembling, face still. A storm with no thunder. Only when a woman near the front clucked her tongue and turned away did Mercy's throat twitch barely. James stepped forward. He didn't speak, just walked bootsteps slow across the brittle dirt. The crowd shifted to let him pass, curiosity muting judgment for a beat. He stood before Gideon, pulled the coin pouch from his coat, and dropped it in the man's open palm. Gideon blinked. "That ain't what I asked." "You offered," James said, voice low. "Solid. I paid." The silence cracked. Mercy lifted her gaze for the first time. Her eyes landed on James like she couldn't quite see him. Not with clarity, not with trust. But she didn't flinch when he turned to her. He didn't offer his hand, didn't ask her name, just nodded once like a promise made beneath the noise. Then he turned and walked away, slow and certain, the wind catching the edge of his coat. Mercy followed. There was no cheer, no applause, only the rustling hush of a crowd unsure what they'd just witnessed. A transaction, yes, but not one they understood. Behind them, the auctioneer cleared his throat and tried to move on. The mare neighed again, but even she seemed quieter now. Martha Crane stood near the back, arms crossed over her apron. She'd seen a lot in Hollow Creek. Seen men drink themselves to death and women forgive too much. But what she'd seen in James Boone's silence unnerved her. Not cruelty, not pity, something else. Something slow and old and buried too deep to name. As James and Mercy climbed into the creaking wagon, a voice called out, "Boone, what you gonna do with her?" He didn't turn, didn't answer, but Mercy sat beside him, shoulders curled like a leaf around its own stem. And when they rolled out of town, no one said a word, but every eye followed them as if watching a ghost pass through their world, gentle and unsettling. On the trail that wound through prairie grass, turned amber by the dusk, Mercy finally spoke. "You don't even know me." James kept his eyes ahead, the reins loose in his hands. "I don't reckon I need to," he said, "but you needed leaving less than you needed talking." She swallowed the knot in her throat harder than bread crusts and shame. The sun bled into the hills, long shadows falling across the road. They rode in silence after that, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid: grief, mercy, hunger, hope, and something like warmth hidden just under the skin of the evening. And by the time they made camp that night, beside a crooked cottonwood, with the stars watching quiet from above, James handed her his coat without a word. She didn't thank him, but she didn't give it back either. In the distance, a lone coyote howled, but inside that small circle of dirt and silence, two souls who'd been counted out by the world sat near each other, unmarried, unspoken, unclaimed, but no longer alone. And that, some would say later, was where the real trade happened. Not in coin, not in flesh, but in the quiet choosing of another's burden, and the long road that followed. The road out of Hollow Creek stretched long and unspoken, carved through fields gone brittle with drought. Wagon wheels moaned across dry earth, a sound that filled the silence between two strangers, too broken to speak and too stubborn to weep. James Boone sat at the reins, his posture steady, but heavy as if grief had weight, and he carried it in his spine. Mercy Talbot sat beside him, her hands folded beneath the coat he'd given her, the one that smelled faintly of pine and leather and smoke. Her eyes didn't leave the horizon, but she wasn't looking forward. She was listening to something inside herself, a sound like glass cracking slow and endless. They rode for hours without words, the wind flicking Mercy's shawl like it was impatient for something to be said. But nothing came. Not until the sun fell behind the ridgeline and the sky bruised purple. James turned off the trail near a shallow creek bed shaded by cottonwoods. He pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down wordless. She didn't ask where they were. She didn't ask if this was home. Instead, she waited for instruction that didn't come. He unhooked the mare, still no name, still no affection, and led her to water. Mercy shifted in the seat, her belly heavy against her thighs, her back sore from hours of stillness. Her boots borrowed from the wagon bed were too wide, but she wore them anyway. Barefoot days were behind her now, she told herself, whatever else this was. James returned and handed her a tin cup of creek water, cool clear. She nodded, accepting it without gratitude, but not without recognition. "I ain't a skin you to explain nothing," he said finally. I wouldn't know how she replied. That was all for a while. He built a fire in a ring of stones, like he'd done it 100 nights alone. Mercy watched the flames rise low and deliberate, the kind of fire that didn't waste heat or light. "Why'd you do it?" she asked softly, not looking at him by me. James sat down across from her, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped like a prayer, not spoken aloud. "You look like someone worth saving," he said, and like someone no one else would. She flinched at that, at how close it was to truth. "My father says I bring trouble. Your father's a drunk who sells what he should protect." James answered, not unkindly. "That ain't gospel." Mercy pressed a palm to her stomach where the child inside shifted, as if sensing judgment nearby. "I don't even know your name," she said. "James Boone." "I'm Mercy. You probably heard." "I did." More silence, but softer now. She ate the hard biscuits he handed her and said nothing when he laid out a blanket a few paces from hers. The air cooled quick once the sun slipped down and the stars arrived without fanfare, quiet and endless above them. That night, Mercy did not sleep. Neither did James. He watched the trees. She watched the dark. And somewhere in between, the fire crackled, and something not quite safety, but close to it, began to take root. By morning, the frost had kissed the edge of the blanket. James rose early and gathered kindling with slow hands. When he turned to check on her, he found her sitting upright, braid, undone eyes red. "You gonna take me back to your farm?" she asked. James nodded. "It ain't much. Got a roof." "Well, land that used to grow corn. You live alone since the burying." "Yeah." Mercy didn't ask who was buried. She already knew. As they rode on, she noticed things she hadn't before. How he clicked his tongue low when the wagon shifted, how his shoulders tightened before every turn, how he glanced at her when she winced over a bump but never asked if she was hurting. He didn't intrude, but he noticed. That evening it rained, thin, cold droplets that felt like apology. They rode through it until James stopped beneath a rocky overhang and covered the wagon with an old tarp he pulled from beneath the bench. Mercy sat huddled, arms wrapped tight, teeth chattering. She hadn't thought she'd be this cold again. Thought shame burned hotter than weather. James hesitated before handing her the coat again. She looked at it, then him, then back at the coat. "You give this every time I look like I'm breaking." "No," he said, "just when you shouldn't have to." She took it this time without the silence. Later, as rain tapped gentle on the tarp, she whispered, "I didn't ask to be with child. I know, but I ain't gonna leave it behind neither." James nodded in the dim, fireless dark. "That's why you're worth it." She blinked slow, unsure if he meant the child or her, or both. The next day brought sun again, and the road flattened. They passed a field of sunflowers gone dry, and bent petals clinging stubbornly, seed heads heavy like bowed heads in prayer. It was there amidst that faded gold that Mercy said, "I tried to run once, before he sold me." James didn't press her. "I thought I'd make it to Fort Daniel, but I didn't even get past the river. He caught me, took my shoes, said next time I'd think twice." A quiet fell. James kept the wagon moving, but the reins in his hand twisted slightly. "No one should be bought," he said, "but some deserve to be chosen." She turned to him, startled by the way he said it, like he'd been waiting a long time to believe it himself. At the edge of a tall ridge, his land came into view, a crooked barn, a small cabin, a well with a tilted beam. No fences, just grass and open air. "That it?" she asked. He nodded. Mercy looked at it like a stranger might look at a church door, not sure if she was welcome or damned. But she followed him when he stepped down, boots landing in dirt that smelled of clay and memory. He didn't carry her bags, didn't open the door for her, just walked ahead and lit the lantern near the porch. Inside, the air smelled of cedar dust and something older. She entered like a ghost, slow, unsure where to rest her hands. There were no pictures, no keepsakes, just a table, two chairs, a stove, and a single quilt folded neat on the cot. "This your whole place?" "It is." "Where'll I sleep?" "You'll have the bed. I'll take the bench." "I ain't a guest," she said. "You're not a servant either." She looked around. The quiet was louder than the wind outside. "You didn't buy me," she whispered. "No," James said. "I took you out of something rotten. That's different. And now we make room." Mercy's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Instead, she nodded. "What?" And that night, while the wind pressed against the walls and the old boards creaked like bones in sleep, she rested beneath his coat and did not dream of being owned or traded or escaped. She dreamt of sunflowers bent but standing. And James, he sat by the window, eyes watching the moon, listening for the sound of peace returning. It hadn't come yet, but it would. They were on the road back. And it was longer than he'd thought, but not too long to walk with someone beside you. The wagon rolled into Hollow Creek at a hush before noon, its iron wheels dragging through a street half dried from last night's rain. Dust clung to the underside like regret, and the townsfolk turned slow to stare, not with welcome, but with that quiet breed of curiosity that settles thick over a place too small to hide new stories. Mercy Talbot sat upright on the bench beside James, her borrowed boots scuffed, and her shawl pulled tighter over the swell of her stomach. She didn't fidget, she didn't smile. Her gaze met no one's, but her spine held straight as a fence post. A girl taught young to endure does not flinch when she's being watched, she just learns not to blink. James tipped his hat to the grocer and the blacksmith, neither of whom tipped back. The butcher's boy whispered something sharp, and his mother tugged him away by the ear, her face turned hard. Women noticed Mercy first. Men noticed James after. They say he bought her, from her own kin. With child already, imagine that. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Words in Hollow Creek traveled better than telegraphs, low, swift, and always trimmed sharp. James didn't respond. He drove the wagon up to the edge of town, where a squat white house with ivy crawling up one side stood like an old woman watching the world go wrong. The sign read Cranebrook Boarding in faded green paint. Martha Crane met them on the porch with flowers still on her hands and suspicion in her eyes. She was round and severe and known to take in strays, dogs, men, or ideas, but only if they knew their place. "You're late, Boone," she said, "and you didn't mention bringing company." James helped Mercy down with a hand under her elbow. "Didn't know I was." Martha looked Mercy over with the precision of a tailor and the tact of a butcher. She hissed. "On my own, Mercy," said before James could speak. Martha's brows rose like shutters, lifting in a storm. Then almost grudgingly, she nodded. "You'll take the room out back." No questions asked, but plenty heard. That fair Mercy nodded, more than I'm used to. The room was clean, but plain, with lace curtains and a bed stiff with starch. There was a small window that looked toward the hills and a basin of water that smelled faintly of lavender soap. Mercy sat on the edge of the bed and took a long breath that almost made it to the bottom of her lungs. James didn't follow her in. He left her there, door half closed, and returned to his wagon like a man who didn't know how to settle between presence and absence. The town didn't forget. Within an hour, news of the girl spread from the milliner's to the chapel steps. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Burney, saw to it that a group of concerned ladies gathered near the dry goods store, speaking of morality and mercy in the same breath. "It sets a dangerous precedent," she said. "Girls carried in like livestock and given a place without penance." Martha Crane overheard this as she picked up flour and beans. "Better to give a girl a place than leave her in a ditch," she muttered. Meanwhile, Mercy kept to the room. She read the same Bible verse 4 times without understanding a word. Then she unpacked her shawl, folded it tight, and stared out the window at the clouds stacking low over the hills. Her baby kicked once, then again. Each time steadier. Each time like a question. What now? Late that evening, James returned with fresh bread and a comb carved from driftwood. He handed it to her without comment. She turned it over in her hand, the wood worn smooth at the handle. "You think I need fixing?" she asked. "No," James said. "Just figure you've gone long without something gentle." Mercy looked at him, then not as a stranger, but not yet as a man she knew. Something in her gaze shifted, something almost soft. "I used to have one like this," she murmured. He didn't ask what happened to it. He just said, "I can patch the roof tomorrow. This place needs some dry corners." That night she combed her hair by lamplight, each stroke steady, untangling not just strands but thoughts. She didn't cry, but she didn't feel numb anymore either. There was something between the two, something like remembering how to live. In the following days, Mercy began to walk through town. Not far, just enough to show she wasn't hiding. At the well, she drew water. At the store, she picked beans with careful hands. At the post, she sat beneath the shade with her shawl folded neatly in her lap. Her silence unsettled the gossips more than any tantrum might have. At the same time, James worked his fields. His return to town was quieter than hers, less discussed, but just as noticed. A man who'd once spent days talking only to his soil now came into the blacksmith's and said, "I'll need hinges for the girl's door. Not the girl I bought, not the girl I saved, just the girl." It was Martha who spoke first. One night after supper, she stopped Mercy on the porch. "You know they'll keep talking," she said. "I reckon," Mercy replied. "Why not fight back? Talk don't wound me." Then what does Mercy looked at the sky, where stars blinked like things that knew better than to speak. "Being nothing," she said. "Being passed over so much I stopped expecting anyone to reach." Martha didn't reply, but the next morning she left a tin of honey biscuits outside Mercy's door with no note. In time, the sharpest gossips dulled. Mercy's steadiness wore them down like river over rock. And James's presence beside her at the chapel gate one Sunday morning sealed something unspoken. He didn't sit next to her inside, didn't touch her arm, but he held the door open and tipped his hat. And for that whole service, not a soul looked her way without first glancing at him. After church, the preacher's wife approached Mercy and offered her a bundle of baby clothes. Her lips were thin and her smile tighter than a corset string, but the gesture was real. "Thank you," Mercy said, tone even. "You'll be watched, Miss Talbot. People want to see what you become. Then I'll make sure it's worth watching." She turned and walked toward James, who waited near the wagon arms, crossed, face unreadable. "That was bold," he murmured. "Being quiet didn't help before." James looked at her then, like maybe he saw something that hadn't been there when they left Hollow Creek the first time. Not a girl, not a burden, not a symbol, but a woman, choosing not to be disappeared. That evening in the cabin room, Mercy sat by the window with the baby clothes folded beside her. She placed the comb on the sill, and as the dust settled like a hymn around her shoulders, she whispered a prayer not for safety, not for justice, but for time. Time to grow. Time to be known. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote howled again. Not like a warning, but like a song sung to those who stayed. James, sitting on the porch, listened. He didn't smile, but something near his ribs shifted warm and aching. He had come to Hollow Creek to be left alone. And now, without meaning to, he'd given that up. Not for love, not yet, but for something quieter, for the sound of a woman reclaiming her space, and the whisper of a town slowly forgetting how to hate. The wind turned warmer that week, thick with the scent of juniper and dry wheat, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Mercy had taken to sitting on the porch just after sunrise, both hands resting atop her belly eyes, scanning the pale fields that curled toward the horizon like pages yet to be written. The baby kicked stronger now, often enough to wake her in the night. Each time it did, James heard her shift in the next room, but never asked, and Mercy never said. They'd grown into a rhythm soft and wordless. He chopped wood. She folded linens. He brought back nails for the warped window frame. She cooked stew from dried beans and root vegetables, always with enough for two. They rarely spoke of the past, and they never said what would come next. But some silences like seeds mean something is growing. It was on a Tuesday that the peace cracked. The sheriff's boots hit the porch boards with an echo too heavy for mourning. James met him at the door, eyes shaded beneath the brim of his hat. "Jude," he said, LOL. Sheriff Jude Mallory was a tall man with a stiff jaw and a kindness that came second to the rules. "Boone," he replied. "Need a word?" Mercy stepped out behind James, her shoulders bracing before her thoughts could catch up. She didn't speak, just watched. The sheriff glanced at her, then cleared his throat. "He's back." James didn't ask who. He knew. Where, he asked. Town. Claims he took what was his. Mercy's fingers gripped the doorframe like it might hold her upright. "I'll come in after chores," James said. The sheriff nodded. "Wouldn't wait too long. Man like that don't drink his patience." He left with the same weight he'd brought. Mercy turned toward James. "He can't take me back." "No," James said. "But he'll try." They didn't eat that day. James stayed outside hammering a gate hinge that didn't need fixing. Mercy stayed inside, staring at her packed bag beneath the cot, the one she never unpacked fully, just in case. By late afternoon, the shadows stretched long, and Mercy watched him from the porch. He wasn't a large man, but he looked immovable, then like the land, like something no longer willing to be moved for anyone. "He's not here for me," she said. James didn't turn. "Then what do you think he's here for? To shame me, to undo what peace I have left." James wiped his hands and looked her full in the face. "You think I'd let that happen? I think people let things happen all the time," she said. He didn't argue, just nodded once, then walked back toward the barn to hitch the mare. In town, the sky dulled to a flat gray, thick with the feel of coming rain. James left Mercy with Martha Crane, who didn't ask questions, just opened her door wide and laid a quilt over the parlor sofa with a mutter of, "You're safe here, girl." That's not a kindness. That's a fact. James found Gideon Talbot outside the saloon, leaning against the post like a man too tired to hate, but too proud to leave without a fight. His beard was darker now, streaked with dust and sweat, and he held a flask like a weapon he hadn't thrown yet. "You made good on a deal," Gideon said, no greeting. "But the girl wasn't yours to keep. She wasn't yours to sell. That ain't what the law says." James said nothing. "You can't fix her, Boone. Some women are cracked right through." "I didn't buy her to fix her," James said. "I gave what you were too low to give a way out. Then give her back." James took a breath so deep the wind paused with him. "You don't scare me, Talbot," he said. "But you ought to fear yourself. You keep cutting pieces from your life. You'll die with nothing left but debt and splinters." The sheriff had come up behind them, quiet watching. "You want to make this legal?" Mallory asked. "No," James said. "He wants to be loud enough someone mistakes him for right." Talbot stepped forward. "You gonna let him steal from me?" he asked the sheriff. "She ain't a mule," Jude replied. "She's a person. She chose to stay. She's carrying sin." "She's carrying a child," James' snapped voice low firm. "And what kind of man are you to leave both out in the wind for someone else to carry?" Talbot scoffed, took a swig, and tossed the flask at James's boots. "You'll regret her," he said. "Mark me." James didn't flinch. "I've regretted plenty," he said, "but not choosing kindness. Not once." Talbot spat at the dirt, then walked off. Not fast, not far, but far enough. The sheriff clapped James once on the shoulder. Town heard that. James only replied, "Good." That night, thunder rolled over the valley like a drum, calling something ancient awake. Mercy stood at the window in Martha's front room, watching the clouds churn black above the hills. She hadn't touched the dinner Martha left on the tray. Her thoughts were somewhere deeper than hunger could reach. When James came through the door soaked to the elbows, she looked at him without speaking. "It's done," he said. Mercy walked to him slow, measured. "Did you raise a hand?" she asked. "No." "Did you wish to?" "Yes." She reached for his coat, peeled it from his shoulders, and laid it across the fire rack without thinking. Then she turned to him, wet shirt clinging to his chest, eyes tired but steady. "You don't talk like other men," she whispered. "I don't feel like other men. You're not afraid of what they say about me. I'm afraid of what you think when you hear it." Mercy's lip trembled. Her hands pressed over her belly like a shield she couldn't drop. "I want to believe I'm more than what he left behind. You already are." The room quieted as if the house itself were listening. In the corner, the fire cracked, once sharp and sudden, and Mercy stepped forward, not to kiss, not to cling, but to place one hand flat against James's chest, to feel the steadiness beneath all that restraint. And when he lifted his hand to cover hers, it wasn't passion that passed between them. It was certainty, and the promise of a storm weathered together. The storm broke just after midnight, a hard wind slapping at the shutters of Martha Crane's parlor as if the sky itself had unfinished business. Mercy Talbot sat upright on the settee, breath-held hands trembling. The baby kicked again, hard this time, a pulse of panic below her ribs. Outside, the lightning split the sky like a crack in a porcelain plate, and thunder rolled deep enough to stir the dead. James Boone had fallen asleep by the fire boots, still on coat drying on the hearth. He stirred the moment she gasped. "It's starting," Mercy whispered. Too early. He was on his feet before she could finish the sentence, kneeling before her, one hand reaching for hers, the other steadying her back. His face, so often a mask of quiet, broke open, then lines deepening, not with fear, but with resolve. "Can you walk? I don't know. You won't have to alone." They didn't wake Martha. James lifted Mercy, carefully carried her out into the storm, with one hand over her belly and one pressed firm to her back. Rain soaked them in seconds, but the cabin wasn't far, not anymore. The wind howled, thunder chased their every step, but James moved with purpose, boots heavy in the mud, every motion a vow. Inside the cabin, it smelled of cedar and iron. The stove was cold, but the wall still held warmth from the last fire. James laid her on the bed as gently as he'd once handled glass, and then moved like a man who'd prepared for this day in his mind 100 times and prayed it wouldn't come too soon. Water boiled, cloths were laid out. A lantern lit and set low its glow, like a whisper across Mercy's face. The pain came sharp. Her hands gripped the edge of the mattress. She bit down not to scream. "I can't do this," she panted. "Yes, you can," James said, voice low. "You already are." And then she did. 4 hours storm above, sweat below. She bore down into the pain, with eyes clenched, knuckles, white breath, ragged. James never left. He held her when she asked. He let her break his wrist bones with her grip. And when she nearly fainted, he cupped her face and said, "You're not alone. Not anymore." And that more than the heat, more than the pain, was what carried her through. At dawn, with rain tapering to a hush, the baby came. A girl, red-faced and howling, slippery with life and fierce with need. James wrapped her in a faded quilt Mercy had stitched in the long afternoons. And when he placed the child in Mercy's arms, something inside her cracked, but not like breaking. Like a dam giving way to something overdue. She cried then, not from pain, from relief, from disbelief. "I thought I'd have to do this with no one," she whispered. "You don't," James said. "Not now. Not again." Outside, the world had washed clean. Trees dripped. The road to Hollow Creek shone wet with morning light. The sky, streaked with pink and silver, looked like forgiveness. Mercy named the child Hope. And when Martha arrived with broth and blankets, she didn't comment on the tears. She just wiped Mercy's forehead and said, "She's yours now, and no one's taking her." By noon, the town had heard. Some shook their heads, some sent pie. Most said nothing but quietly moved their judgment aside. And James, he stood on the porch that evening, with the child in his arms, and Mercy in the doorway, tired but upright hair undone, face soft with exhaustion and something like joy. When the preacher passed by, he tipped his hat, and James, holding Hope close, said, "She's not mine by blood." But the preacher asked, "But she's mine by choice." Mercy stepped forward, then placed a hand on James's shoulder, and the three of them stood like a thing settled. Not perfect, but whole. Later that week, Mercy placed the comb on the windowsill beside a dried sunflower from the ridge. She swept the floor slowly, humming under her breath. James watched her from the doorway, how her hand curved protectively over the baby asleep in the sling, how her feet knew this floor like she belonged. "You still think you were bought?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No. I think I was claimed by someone who saw past shame." "Then you'll stay, I already have." Outside, the hills were green again. The land once brittle and cracked had softened. The barn stood repaired, the well full, and the cabin. The cabin stood not because of nails or stone, but because two people once unwanted had built something from nothing, together. Let this be the story remembered, that a man with grief in his marrow chose kindness over silence, that a girl with no name left was seen and stayed, and that in a world full of auctions and abandonments, there are still men who walk away from the trade and toward the fire, the kind of fire that warms, the kind that stays lit through storms. And to you listening now, wherever your burden, however your past, remember this. You are not the price someone put on you. You are not the hands that let go. You are the place you choose to stand. And sometimes the cabin is not just shelter. It's the promise that you're no longer alone.